Do you feel as though Paris is pivoting, and what's the reaction in Washington?
Well, first of all, good to be with you, and condolences to the victims and their families of the horrible attack last week in Paris. This has definitely captivated the world's attention, and I think focused energies in Washington on how we can deal with ISIS and how we can prevent this terrorist threat from striking Europe or the United States again. I think there's a little more wariness in Washington about who we should be working with. I think we found over the last 3 or 4 years of the growing conflict in the Middle East that the enemy of our enemy can still be our enemy in the Middle East, and also that there's multiple issues that we're dealing with in the Middle East. As your correspondent noted, it's not just about fighting ISIS. It's also about trying to get rid of the Assad regime. It's also, I would add, dealing with Iran and its role in supporting the Assad regime and its nuclear program as we're trying to implement that nuclear deal that was just signed. So how we balance all of those is important, and whether cooperation with Russia and Iran is the right thing to do at a time when we're also worried about Russian intervention in the Ukraine. So balancing all those different concerns is something that is a hot topic these days in Washington.
And we saw on Monday Barack Obama flatly ruling out any more deployment of U.S. forces to Iraq, and he's drawn heat from it, reading the press in Washington this Tuesday.
Well, I think there's certainly a sense that the Paris attacks should be a wake-up call, as we've had several in the past, that ISIS is a greater threat than we've previously acknowledged, and that they're not being contained. They're not a junior varsity team, as various leaders have said in the past, and that we really need a new strategy to do more against them. And I think there's frustration that President Obama hasn't articulated a new strategy, but seems to insist that the strategy that he already has in place is the right one. That doesn't mean there's necessarily appetite in Washington for boots on the ground in Syria, but at least a rethinking and an attempt to take the lessons of the last week and apply them to what we're doing in Syria.
And Blaise, what's your gut feeling when you hear John Kerry talk about us being weeks away from some kind of major transition? Is he right?
It's hard to know. I think there's definitely been a catalyst for conversations both at the G20 summit in Turkey this weekend as well as the Vienna summit. And I think it's very possible that the Russians are willing to trade some movement on Assad in return for some legitimation of their efforts in Syria and a general forgetting of what they've done in Ukraine. Is that a good bargain? It's hard to tell until we know what the contours of it are. But it definitely seems like there's appetite to try to put some of these problems behind us.
Let me also ask you about how people feel about things where you are. We know that there's now stepped up security in the U.S. after fresh threats from ISIS.
I think definitely the fear and vigilance that I'm sure has taken root in Paris and France is felt here as well, especially after the ISIS video released recently that said that they would be targeting America and Washington specifically. We had an incident just earlier today where a flight taking off from a Washington airport was called back because some passengers said they saw suspicious activity among some Middle Eastern passengers on the plane. So there's definitely a sense of heightened vigilance here and concern about what's going to come next.
Blaise Misztal of the Bipartisan Policy Center, many thanks for joining us today.